Well, I'll back up just a tiny little bit about where I've come from, and I was a big-time captive. I grew up in the 60s. Not a very pretty picture because at a very young age, grew up in a fatherless home. I had a tendency to look for love in all the wrong places. I didn't know what I was looking for. I did not grow up in a Christian home. I didn't have a clue about what Christianity was. I think we might have gone to church a few different times, but it was not a necessarily pleasant experience for me. It was just something to try and do. I went with my mom. But it is so vital and important that little girls especially have daddies in their lives, because when we don't, we are just seeking that father's love. That seeking got me in a lot of trouble, moving from, I was born in Hartford, but then ended up in Columbus, Ohio by the time I was a year old. That's when my father left my mom and I. And then I ended up in New York City. My mom, she was a little bit of a rebel herself, and she ended up marrying a jazz musician, and it took her on a journey to New York City, which is where I eventually ended up when they called for me to come out there. At that time, she had married, and she was expecting her second child. It was a very difficult journey for me going to New York City. Going to New York City was a real eye-opener. I felt like I was thrown in the midst of the pack. I came from an all-white school when I was there, and I got thrown into PS 109 in New York City, and it was a real trip. It was very hard, very difficult. At about 11 years of age, I started really pressing the limits with my mom, who had now had a new little girl. My way of functioning was hanging out with kids that were doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. And that's kind of where I ventured from there. The older I got, naturally, as I got closer to my teenage years, I was doing all kinds of stuff that I shouldn't have been doing. You can just about name it, and I was doing it, and it wasn't a good thing. And I got lonelier, and I got harder. My heart just got hard as nails, and finally I didn't care. I just thought, it's all about me, and I'm going to just strive to satisfy me. And that was kind of the generation that was coming up from then. The women's lib thing was all starting there, and we became protesters, but I felt a little bit like a rebel without a cause, because I was so young, I didn't know that much about it. I didn't really know why we were protesting and doing all these crazy things. Then, by the time that I became a teenager, I started really getting into some troubles and cutting school, because school at that time, it was a challenge, and I didn't need a challenge, especially when I was hanging out with crazy friends that just wanted to party and have fun. I ended up getting in lots of trouble, ended up having to leave home because they were going to put me somewhere. That got worked out so that I ended up in a kind of a halfway house for a time being, but still on drugs and still doing all kinds of things that a person shouldn't be doing. At 15, Woodstock was coming along, and a girlfriend and I ran off to Woodstock. And that was the last time I saw my mom for about 3 years. It was the craziest place I've ever seen in my life. It's so hard for me to even watch some of that, because I look at it and I just can't believe that I was there as such a young girl. Because I've had kids. I know what it's like. I've got 3 children. I know what it's like to have a 15-year-old, and to think that 15-year-old would be in a place like that just makes me crazy. Somehow God walked me along. I didn't have a clue who God was. I didn't care. All I knew is I needed to be filled up. Somehow I needed to be filled up. That journey took me to communal living throughout the United States, from New York City, or upstate New York where Woodstock was, to New Mexico, living in a commune. Got pregnant. The guy rejected me, and so it was flee, run as far and as fast as you can, and only God knew I would end up in Minnesota. Sometimes you got to put a lot of space between you and the hurt, you and the pain. And it was in Minnesota that I ended up in a commune in just about 80 miles south of the border here. Had my first child, born right on the farm. And I thought I was okay. That's the strange part, is we think we're okay when we're wrapped up in this world we're living in. It was what I had. I didn't have a normal upbringing. I didn't have a father in the home. I didn't know what it was like to have the respect of a father, and then to expect a man to turn around and be respectful with me. No, it was sad. And unfortunately, when my kids were growing up in teenage years, I have 1 daughter and 2 boys, and I was so overprotective with my daughter, and I'm glad that God worked everything out wonderfully because she's a delight now. But boy, we went through some really tough times. Why? Because I wanted to protect her from all that I'd been through. Although I can say I didn't know anything about God, I didn't have a clue what God and church and Christian living was all about. I didn't become a believer until I was 30, and it took me getting up here to the icebox of the nation to finally figure it out. Well, God finally revealed himself in a really beautiful way to me. So I struggled along. As a mom with a single mom with a little boy, I ended up in a really difficult marriage. I was married for 6.5 years to a very abusive man. We had 2 children, and he was very abusive to the kids, physically abusive. Just was a very harsh disciplinarian. He was an alcoholic. I have alcoholic tendencies because they go back in my genealogy. And I didn't realize that that's what was going to kind of manifest itself as I was going along. And I just got to that place where I'd been hurt too much. That's my personality. My personality is such that I will go along for such and such a time. I will put up with so much, and then I've had it. And that was the way it got for my marriage. I just had it. I was going to show him what this was all about, the pain, the hurt. Dumb thing to do. I didn't realize how I was hurting myself in the process. Okay, I'd been a drug abuser. I sexually active at a very extremely young age. Here I am now. I'm indulging in alcohol. So it's like, what next? What can you keep doing here? That was all part of. I'll show you. I'll show you what it's like. So after 6.5 years, we divorced. I went right from one relationship into another, because that's my pattern. When you're looking for love, and I know I see some heads nodding, and I know some of you girls know exactly what that's like. You just keep thinking it's going to work the next time. And every time you come to a new relationship, you've got all this stuff back here that you haven't dealt with. And that makes it really hard to enter into something fresh and clean. It just doesn't happen. You've got to deal with the stuff in your life. So from one relationship into the next, I brought my garbage, and they had a drinking problem, and so we just didn't start out on a very, very good leg, and it took about 4 years to get married. But you know what? God really began to work in that time in my life, because he kept saying, come to me. I kept feeling this nudging of God in my life. Come to me. I was so hurting. This guy was great to me. He treated me well. He treated my kids well. And I kept thinking, why am I not happy? Something's wrong here. I should be thrilled. He's a good dad to my kids. And it wasn't enough. Lo and behold, God always has a plan. He always does. He begins to put people in your life. And the very first thing that started happening is I began to listen to that crazy Christian radio station that I swore no one would ever listen to. Who in their right mind would ever listen to a Christian radio station? But see, it was ministering to me. Focus on the family at that time. All about raising kids and difficulties, and I was going, yeah, I hear, that's me, And then I started watching the 700 Club, and it's like, oh my gosh, look at those people, those testimonies, those stories. That's what got my heart, people's stories. That's kind of what gives me the strength to stand up here and share with you guys, because I heard there was hope in those messages, and that's how I became a Christian. I prayed with Pat Robertson. I put my hand out to the TV. It seemed like the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of in my life. But I did, and I prayed, and I accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, realizing that I could no longer live this life on my own. I tried. I really did give it my best, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't what God had intended for me. Well, it caused some turmoil in my relationship with the man I was living with, and basically we did end up getting married. Had to twist his arm a little bit, but all that to be said is it didn't mean that things got perfect, but it gave God permission to begin to work in my life and in his, because he'd grown up in the church. So that part is really kind of cool, the way it all turned out. I'll interject a few things as we go along here, but a little bit of my story. The bottom line is I'm here, and I heard a guy say it this morning in church. Hey, world, I'm a miracle. And to each and every one of us who calls upon the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, did you know you're a miracle? Because without him, you're going to hell. It's that simple, period. Without him, you're going to hell.